Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be taking a look at a practical guide to the 3-act structure by J6. Basically the idea here is that we're going to be taking a look at the traditional 3-act format to help aid our storytelling. What is the 3-act structure? The 3-act structure is a model used in narrative fiction that divides the story into 3 parts or acts, often called the setup, the confrontation, and the resolution. It was popularized by Sid Field in his 1979 book screenplay, The Foundations of Screenwriting. This is the basic picture of the 3-act structure as provided by a website called Studio Binder. As always, I will be linking all the resources I use in the description below. In addition, I only will be going over a portion of what's actually in the book, so I highly suggest you go ahead and take a look at the book for yourself. I will link that as well in the description below. Here we can see 3 distinct parts of the story. We have our setup, confrontation, and resolution. The idea here is that our first act is going to be an introduction to not only the characters, but also to the scene itself. Depending on the type of story we're writing, we could be taking a look at world building or just the characters themselves, depending on the setting. If you're talking more romance, you're going to be focusing more on the characters and the day-to-day and getting people interested in actually following the characters. Where in Act 2, we are allowing the story to become a lot more tense in regards to the types of actions and the stakes that are needed to drive the story forward. In Act 3, we're going to be hitting a climax of the story, after which we will have the resolution where the whole story wraps up. Now, for each story, it's going to be different, as well as the fact that when we're talking about a series, each book has to have its own 3 acts in order to tell the story efficiently. Now, as always, these are just tools that we can use to help tell our story better. So, while the 3-act is probably one of the most common, there are other types of structure that we actually can use as well. One is a 5-act structure. I will hopefully be going over that in a future video. So let's get into this book itself. Act 1. Hooking readers, crafting, and engaging beginning. The opening of your story is like a handshake with your reader. It sets the tone, introduces key elements, and most importantly, makes a promise. This story is worth your time. Now, there's a number of different ways of making these promises. Sometimes it is information that is dripped along and given a little bit of information at a time. Typically, you actually don't want to give the whole situation away or the whole setting away. You actually want to drip this information to keep the readers reading, particularly when that information is actually really interesting in of itself. So for instance, if you're telling a story and you have a world that doesn't use gasoline, how does this play into how the story is going to play out? The fact that you drip information along the way means that they are going to be interested in continuing their reading so they can learn how the story cycles around the fact that there's no gasoline in this world. 1. Establishing tone and voice. The tone and voice of your story are set from the very first words. Is your story dark, mysterious, light and humorous, or epic and adventurous? The tone will guide the reader's emotional journey, while your voice, how you uniquely express your story, will establish the connection with the reader. When we're talking about establishing connection, if you ever take a look at a book, you will see that the author's name is actually bigger. This is typically done when the author is very famous. This way that we are capitalizing on the connection that the author has established with its following. So if you have a big author, say Stephen King, typically you'll see the name a lot bigger because they are actually not necessarily looking to draw the people who don't know who Stephen King are based off of what's going on in the story, but rather they're looking to focus on people who have already read Stephen King books and actually are interested in reading him. The reason why they're interested in reading him is because he has already established a connection with the reader. That is what they talk about when they say voice. 2. Introducing the protagonist. Readers will want someone to root for, and introducing your characters early on is key to drawing them in. One of the things that we always need to make sure that we're paying attention to is we don't want to waste our readers' time. If we are creating a situation, a scene, that our readers are first entering this world in, we have to make sure that it is worth the time of the reader to delve into it. Well, as interesting it might be to talk about the formation of the world, or talking about non-plot involved situations in the beginning of the story, On one hand, you might think that's a good idea because we're talking about world building. But if we are not necessarily talking about the story in such a way that it actually draws the reader into the plot, we could be wasting their time. And the last thing we want to do as writers is actually waste our readers' time. 3. Creating a compelling situation. A powerful way to hook readers is by plunging them directly into the situation that demands their attention. When we're talking about setup, we're talking about making sure that we are starting off the story as quickly as possible. Yes, it might help create a understanding of the character if we see them go throughout their day, say on the farm. But if we do that too much, if we show too much of that, we actually lose the reader's interest in how they feel about this character. Yes, it might be true that this character actually spends a couple hours on the farm, milking, herding sheep, cleaning up after dogs. These are things that could be actually part of the character and could be helpful in understanding that character. But the problem is that they aren't going to find it interesting. Our readers are going to want to delve right into the story as quickly as possible, provided the fact that we give them enough information for them to continue the story. 4. Posing a question or mystery. One of the most effective ways to grab the reader's attention is by posing a question or introducing a mystery that demands resolution. Like I said earlier, you can hint at world building or different things about how this world is set up that will grab the reader's attention and help them grow more involved into the story themselves. So, given what I had said earlier about there being no gasoline, are we talking about a magical system where they don't need gasoline? Are we talking about another source of propulsion? So is this a steampunk? Is this a oil punk? Like, are we talking about a world where they actually get oil from biological means, such as whales or other biological creatures, that they are able to use in providing propulsion for this world? 5. Starting in media res. Another technique to consider is beginning your story in media res, a Latin term meaning in the midst of things. The earlier you get your characters involved into the plot, the more likely your readers are going to be interested in the story that you're telling. What I mean by this is the fact that, if I had mentioned earlier, you want to start off as quickly as possible. Now, a lot of what writers do is they actually start early on. So in prologues, you'll actually see this starting off of the story as quickly as possible by actually starting with man or person is running in the middle of the night against the enemy. This is what they mean when they talk about media res. They're talking about getting the reader hooked into the story as much as possible. Now with the prologue, this is kind of a cliche. They'll start off with a person running away from the enemy and they get caught, and then they will cut to boy on the farm. And this is how they start the story, by getting that media res early on, but then falling back to what the character that we're looking to follow is beginning to start their day in. By hooking the reader as early as possible, we increase our chances of our readers actually being interested in the story. But like prologues have become cliche, we need to make sure that we aren't doing things in a way that is going to be cliche ourselves. We need to make sure that we're telling our story that our readers are emotionally connecting to our characters. Establishing the stakes. From the outset, it's important to hint at what's at stake in your story. When we're talking about stakes, we're talking about, hey, if this person doesn't do this thing, here are the consequences. That's not to say that these consequences can't shift over the course of time. If you have a heist, and what happens is that in the midst of their heist, they find out that a very big issue is going to arise if they don't take care of this other issue really quickly. So as an example, we could easily say something along the lines of this. You have a 5-member crew that is looking to steal information in regards to a very specific thing in their story. But what ends up happening is that during the course of that heist, they actually find out that the information that they're stealing is actually going to be used by a much bigger bad guy than the persons who had it beforehand. And the fact that they have already given this information to it, they have to address that and steal it from this other person. Yes, stakes are important, but we need to make sure that we realize that they are not inflexible in how we tell our story. Making a promise. Finally, an effective opening often makes a subtle promise to the reader about what the story will deliver. So this goes back to what we're talking about when we're talking about introduction. By just saying the fact that there is no gasoline in this world, we are making promises that this is a modern world. This is a world that already has some of the amenities that we could understand today. But because of the limitations that we're putting on ourselves, we actually are able to develop different ideas off of how we tell things. So for instance, we have petrol-based products. What are they using instead? Did they have something else that they've discovered? So if there's no petrol, if there's no oil that they use to make gasoline, are they talking about having glass products everywhere? How does that affect the economy? How does that affect how the world plays out? We're trying to create a subtle promise to our reader that is easily attainable by our skill. As we become more skillful, we're able to deliver these promises to our reader in a way that best fits what we're trying to achieve. Act 2. Build rising tension. Develop the middle of your story with dynamic characters, escalating conflict, and meaningful stakes. The middle of your story is often considered the heart of the narrative. This is where your characters are fully developed, conflicts intensify, and the stakes become increasingly clear. It's the section where your readers are most deeply engaged, invested in the outcome, and eager to see how everything unfolds. One of the things that we always have to keep in mind is that we always want to make sure that our readers feel like our characters are always at risk. It's very disheartening for a reader to realize as they're reading it that nothing this character goes through, the hero, the person that we are following, nothing that they go through is actually putting them at risk. We have to make sure that we're establishing an emotional connection, and part of that is actually creating risk for the character. So while we understand as writers that it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for us to kill the main character at the beginning, because that would be the end of the story, we need to make sure that we're also allowing for the stakes to rise and have our readers feel like the character is at risk. Act 2 is typically divided into 2 parts. Part 1, the first half, rising action. Here the protagonist reacts to an inciting incident and begins their journey. They face obstacles, gain allies, and start to understand the scope of the challenge ahead. The tension gradually builds as protagonists become more invested in the outcome. Here, we are not necessarily showing the type of person that the character was, but the type of character this person can become. These are different ways that we can show that this person, while they were typically, as for part of the, if we go back and use that old style of Boy on the Farm, we are showing the type of person that he was. And as we're in the first act, we are showing what he can be. We are setting the stakes and saying this is where the character needs to grow to in order to actually be the hero. The second half, midpoint and further escalation. The midpoint marks a significant turning point in the story, often a moment of revelation, a major plot twist, or a shift in the protagonist's goals. After the midpoint, the stakes increase dramatically, and the protagonist is pushed towards the climax. We should always want to make sure that we are increasing the stakes, because one of the issues is if we let off too much, not to say that we can't let off at all, but if we let off too much, we can bore our readers and actually have them stop in the middle of the book. By increasing that stake, we are drawing the readers along with us, sort of like a carrot at the end of the stick. We need to make sure that we are promising that they are going to find something bigger and better later on in the story. But if we allow that lull too much, we actually kill any sort of desire. If we pull that carrot too far away, we remove that incentive to keep reading. And once the reader puts down the book, there is a chance that they might not pick it up again. That's just the nature of reading. If we don't give the reader a reason to keep reading, even if they have to put it down because of life, we need to make sure that their mind is always drawn back to the book and wondering how the story is going to end. 1. Dynamic character development. Ensure your protagonists and supporting characters grow and evolve, and use relationships and internal conflict to add depth. One of the things that we can recognize is that relationships tell us as much about the character as much as how much they are looking to grow and how much they're able to overcome the problems that they have. When they're talking about internal conflicts here, they're talking about this person wants A, but recognizes that B is better, and how they overcome that problem is how we can understand their character development. And when we talk about relationships, there's a passage in the Bible that says iron sharpens iron, And so one man sharpens the countenance of his friend. This is the same thing. We're using iron to sharpen other iron. We're using characters to sharpen each other so that they are able to overcome the issue that they have to deal with to have the successful resolution of the story. 2. Escalating conflict. Introduce new obstacles, layer conflicts, increase pressure, and use midpoint twists to propel a story forward. One of the things we can also do here is actually expand. So instead of having a twist, for instance, like you would see in an M. Night Shyamalan movie, you actually have an expansion of the situation rather than a twist that we would currently understand. So for instance, going back to the idea that I had earlier about a world without gasoline, what if the reason why that there was no gasoline is because of a outside influence, that because of how things played out with that, it actually caused the gasoline, the petrol, to be removed? And why does that make sense, and why does that have an effect on the world? And these are all different things that we can do to actually create a expansion of the story that escalates the conflict. Deepening stakes. Personal, moral, and global stakes should become more significant, creating a sense of urgency and emotional resonance. One of the issues that I want to point out here is that you can't make the stakes too deep. So for instance, when we're looking at the MCU, we're talking about a huge catalog of different stories that are told. In the first Avengers movies, we're talking about a world-ending invasion. But as we move on, they have to increase the stakes to the point where it's almost not understandable to the human mind. So for instance, while everybody could truly understand the horrors of being invaded in the first Avengers movie, by the time we got to Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, it was hard for the reader, the consumer, to truly understand what was going on. So when we're talking about deepening stakes, we want to make sure that we try to keep it as close to the characters as possible, that we have a emotional and moral stakes that are deepening, that we can tie to the characters and therefore have that emotional connection deepened. Act 3. Deliver a satisfying conclusion. Master the art of the climax and resolution, ensuring your readers leave with a lasting impact. One of the issues that can actually happen is when you tell a story and you have a situation where it doesn't resolve itself properly, you actually cause a frustration in your reader where they don't actually want to pick up another book that you have written. That's why this is important. This isn't necessarily important for the story itself, but rather when we're talking about your voice, you are trading on your voice when it comes to sales and whatnot. So ensuring that your readers are getting what they're expecting. So when we're using our voice, we're trading on the potential worth of it. So when we want to leave our readers with a lasting impact, we want it to have it satisfying emotionally for them. We don't want to pull the rug out from underneath of them so that they feel unsatisfied with how the story plays out. 1. Crafting the climax. Build up the climax with rising tension, ensure it's emotionally charged, deliver a satisfying payoff, and time it effectively. This is what we're talking about when we're talking about a satisfying payoff. We want to make sure that we are telling a story and that it makes sense, that our characters are emotionally at risk, so that it connects with our readers emotionally. This is why we try to avoid the idea of a deus ex machina, where we are creating a way out that doesn't give a satisfying payoff. Crafting the resolution. Tie up loose ends, show character growth, reflect on the themes, and end with a resonant image or moment, and consider a twist or final revelation. Now, one of the things that we can fall afoul of here is the fact that when we're talking about a final twist or revelation, it actually undoes everything that we're trying to do. There are plenty of examples where you'll watch a TV show or you'll hear about a TV show where in the last final revelations, it actually undoes the whole story, actually creating a dissatisfying resolution. Like we were talking about earlier, one of the ways that we can keep in mind is that our readers going to enjoy how this story plays out? This is why they always used to say happily ever after. This is creating a emotional resonance that continues with the characters and our readers at the end of the story. So in the end, The three-act setup is one of the many ways that we can tell a story. It is not a requirement for people to actually tell a story this way, but it's just a tool that we can use to help tell our story better. As I said earlier, I hope to use a 5-act setup sometime later so that we can go over and see how that can help us tell our stories. All right, that's all I had for today. As always, I will leave all the information I use in the description below. If you have any comments, questions, concerns, please leave it in the comment section below. Until next time, bye.
I am a poor, wayfaring stranger. I'm traveling through this world of woe. Yet there's no sickness, toil, nor danger in that bright land to which I go.